Seventh grade. Hey, seventh grade. Here's what we got. I know that we've had a lot of people in, out, unsure, etc. You do have a test on China and North Korea on Monday, April 3rd. So I'm going to go over some of the stuff with you so that way we're on the same page. Now, I don't feel like I need to go through a couple of these questions on the doc, all right? But we've looked at how China's the largest country, how then there was a split and after the dynasties ended, and then we saw Taiwan form because Chiang Kai-shek left and then went to what is now Taiwan, and how Taiwan was very important because Taiwan dominates 65% of the world's global production of computer chips to China's 5. So it gives you an idea that Taiwan is that much more important in the computer chip industry than China. We then watched the video and discussed about Mao Zedong, who became the first leader of the People's Republic of China. That is what China is today, the People's Republic of China, a communist society, just like Stalin's and Marx's and Lenin's Russia. Now, one of the things is Mao Zedong wanted the people to leave behind the old and go with what he thought was the new. So Mao Zedong basically said, we're going to go to a full communist society. Zedong then sought that he wanted to follow the Soviet Union's models of government communism. We looked at the Great Leap Forward, how all of a sudden it was the sense that because China was getting so big, that here's what we're going to do. The Great Leap Forward was a way to go from agrarian to modern and industrial in 5 years. Well, it didn't work. He sent millions of people to farm and then millions of people to build steel and melt down things out of metal and steel. It just didn't work. So China couldn't industrialize. Millions of lives were lost. Millions of people didn't have food. Millions of people were worked to get to death. It just didn't work. It was kind of like a failed kibbutz. So it just wasn't working out that way. Again, during this 2-year failure, people were encouraged to build backyard furnaces and melt their possessions to make steel. But these steel mills were a failure. Agriculture was a failure. And so eventually it changes, okay? Eventually it changes. But I'm going to go in a different little bit of order here because we get to what's a cultural revolution in the 1960s and 70s. Mao Zedong, who is still the leader of the People's Republic of China, communism, he comes out with these little concepts called the Red Books. These little red books are the values of old customs and old ideas and values being gone. So destroy everything that is of old customs. So old values, old culture, old ideas, everything old. We're creating a new China. And this was a time where kids went to school, and it was said that we didn't study anything in school, said one citizen. Teachers wanted to teach, but students wouldn't listen. It's kind of like today. The idea was that the new youth were going to take over and lead a new China. And so that the old ways of China are gone. Everything pre-1949 needs to be gone. And so Mao employed these Red Guards. These Red Guards were members of China's well-educated and rich class, and mainly children. And what they did with their little red books is they went around and they destroyed old history of China. And they also humiliated and tortured and sometimes even killed old teachers and people who knew of older culture. It's kind of like the Nazis burning books. It's kind of like the Nazis getting rid of the older people and this idea of Hitler Youth. And those that were banished by the Cultural Revolution, they fled and they were exiled. And it wasn't until after Mao Zedong died that these elders to society came back. Mao said, we want a country first. And he said, we want the nation to be all about China first, the individual person last. When Mao died, a man named Deng Xiaoping took over. Where we get to him. Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was the person who opened up China. He was known as the father of modern China. You watched the video and saw how he visited the United States. He visited Europe and Singapore and Japan and saw just how fast forward those countries were compared to China. They just couldn't keep up. The cars, the trains, the bridges, the technology in China were so far behind the rest of the world. And it was because China remained so insular, because China remained so dependent on only itself, that it thought it being independent of the world could do something. And Deng Xiaoping saw this and went, no, 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 we are way behind. And so Deng Xiaoping then opened up the door between China and the world. Now, kind of shifting gears a little bit. In the early 1980s, the country's growth begins. The commune system of communist China starts to disband. Economic opportunities open up in China. There's a new constitution. And now we see modernish China. Now, we talked also about energy. Huge amounts of populations require huge amounts of energy. And most electricity is from coal. And we know that coal is not a healthy or a safe, non-renewable resource. It's a dirty resource. It's a dirty fossil fuel. But China has 1 billion people. 1.4 billion people need electricity. They need energy. And so what China did was they built what was called the Three Gorges Dam. This Three Gorges Dam that began in 1993, okay, it was 1.5 miles wide. It was 600 feet tall, and it basically dammed up a 3,400-mile river. And it was gigantic. The concept of making a dam this big to generate hydroelectric power was incredible, because this hydroelectric dam would provide more energy for more people, and it was cleaner than coal. But there's always a consequence to something being progressive. The reservoir where they dammed it up, it destroyed 13 cities, 440 towns, hundreds of villages, thousands of farmland underwater in China. Years of families had to leave. They weren't asked permission to leave. They were told, we're going to dam up this river, and so then you're going to have to leave. So all of these little sites, all of these historic sites and cities didn't exist. They were gone. They were abandoned, and China dammed up the river. Also, it changes the ecosystem of the animals. Certain plants and animals die out, but in the sense, again, it's a way for getting energy to 1 billion people. So unfortunately, China's massive population and its second largest consumption of energy in the world, today the United States is the largest, it's led to this problem. Now, if we move forward a little bit, to get to life after Mao Zedong again and get to Deng Xiaoping, we then get to what we see in the 1980s, these SEZs, these special economic zones. You notice that these special economic zones are all along the coast. They're all port cities, so that way goods can be brought in and sent out of China. Before the 1980s, really, American and other foreign companies didn't operate in China. In case you're not realizing this, this unit is heavily economic and political more than anything else. And if you think about it, the world economy right now runs through China and the United States, Vietnam, Mexico, and other countries that are third worldish becoming developing-ish. Now, these SEZs, they have the freedom to do what goods they want to make and at what prices to sell them. So, for example, Apple operates in an SEZ. Nike, Gillette, Ray-Ban, they operate in SEZs. So they don't have to ask the government of China, hey, we're going to make these, how much can we charge? No, they can make them and send them wherever they want in the world, because China gets a little bit of this money back by having all of these Chinese workers making the products. So it's a way that China also gets some of the Western culture, and it's a way that China gets jobs, and it's a way that we get products cheaper. If you had an iPhone made in the United States of America, the thing would cost thousands of dollars. In China, it costs maybe $1,000 now, but the best part about it is that in China, it's double, sometimes triple the price of buying an iPhone in China than the United States, because what China wants to do is prevent as much American influence as possible. So China has its own cell phone company and own technology company, Huawei, and those cell phones and that technology is cheaper. So that way, Chinese people are inspired to buy more Chinese technology than American technology. Now, these SEZs have brought 20 million jobs since 1980. But problems is these jobs are filled with migrant workers for the rural areas of China. And so the rural areas, then people move away from their families and move away from where they were, and they move into these cities. And though these wages are not high, now these people can earn money. So Chinese citizens work for Apple, Microsoft, Dell, Ray-Ban, Gillette, etc. This is made in these SECs, which allows China to get a little bit wealthier. So now a billion people have now been lifted out of poverty because of manufacturing in China. Now, economic progress we saw doesn't necessarily mean progress for the Chinese citizens. On June 4th, 1989, we saw these massive protests in Tiananmen Square, pro-democracy protests, mainly younger people, students, occupied the square. They were frustrated with the limits on political freedom and economic freedom they had and their lack of education system. The students said that they weren't able to get the jobs they wanted because the government limited their education and limited their ability to get free speech. Now, again, remember when Deng Xiaoping opens up the testing for kids to go to school, well, it's only certain kids that go to school. And so those kids go to school, but they're only getting so much of an education. And in some cases, in the 1980s, when there were Chinese citizens going all over the world to work, they realized their education wasn't as good as another country's education. So they were behind. So China needed to do a better job of providing an education for their citizens. But the people in China didn't know what they didn't know. The Chinese citizens didn't know their education was second. They didn't realize how limited their freedoms were until they saw the true outside world. Again, you don't know what it's like in Finland unless you go to it. You don't know what it's like in Bolivia unless you go to it. People in China don't know what it's like in America until they come here. So it was a big deal. Thousands, almost 1 million people occupied Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And we saw the video of the tank man. The military is sending in tanks, dozens of tanks, and thousands of soldiers to attack and put down these students protesting for more freedoms, for more academic opportunities. But China doesn't want these things to make the public news because it makes China look backwards. We saw that this made the news because now networks like CNN and other networks, news networks, are able to go into China and cover stories. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the people in China see and hear these stories. So the tank man, as we talked about in class, we don't know who Tank Man is. We have no idea. Nobody knows who Tank Man is. And in fact, in Tiananmen Square, if you Google Tiananmen Square or the Tiananmen Square massacre or June 4th, 1989, in China, it's firewalled. Kids don't learn about this stuff. It would be as if German kids were not taught about Kristallnacht, as if the government in Germany tried to get rid of all history of Kristallnacht. It's the same concept. We then talked about the China Belt and Road Initiative. It's based off of really the Silk Road. So the Belt and Road Initiative, China in 2013 said they wanted to create a network of building international roads, bridges, ports, shipping facilities, fast rail, airports, dams, coal-fire-powered stations, skyscrapers, and tunnels that would connect everything they could. The idea was the belt after the ancient Silk Road, and China provided 151 foreign nations these projects, 68 countries. That's up to 70 now. The idea was China says, we're going to invest in your country. So I'm going to scroll here. If we take a look at this, what we say the Maritime Silk Road, the light blue. So China is shipping goods to Kenya. So in Kenya, there is a port city that was created where trade would flow. China spent the money to build a port, to build factories, to build shipping ports, to build shipping containers, etc. So that way Kenya could get goods easier from other countries and then ship goods from Africa out of Kenya. So it would help them with imports and exports. And building this stuff means more jobs. More jobs means more money. More money means more wealth. And the company and the country can spend more. However, China built these projects and they built them at such a rapid rate. They didn't always build it with the best technology and the best foundation. So some of the dams and the bridges and the hydroelectric power plants, some of these projects are breaking already because China just wanted to hurry up and build them so that they could get the money. So now it's 2023, 10 years afterwards, China's $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative project is failing in some places. And so the countries are having to reevaluate this. Well, why don't they just stop building and why don't the countries say no anymore? Think about this. In Kenya, they owe China for building that factory, that port, that shipping area in Kenya. So Kenya owes China for building that. So if Kenya doesn't pay them back, the Chinese will take over it. Same thing with all of these countries, all of these areas. So oil pipelines, gas pipelines, ports, railways, all of these railroads, all of these roads, if the other countries can't pay back China for building it, because China offers to build it for a certain rate, then China takes over it. It's a brilliant way for China to take over the infrastructure, bridges, roads, tunnels, energy plants, everything. So that way the other countries have to owe China. It's brilliant. Now, when we get to this Belt and Road Initiative, it takes us to how presidents interact with China as well. Okay? Richard Nixon opens up China, and Presidents Bush and Presidents Obama, they wanted to have a tough stance on China because they realized that, wow, everything's made in China. And so they wanted to have a tougher stance on China. They wanted to enforce more difficult laws. They wanted to ensure that, they wanted to ensure that the United States wasn't economically and politically taken advantage of. But we were. China's growth in the economy is staggering. In fact, only really 4 countries in the world grew during the coronavirus pandemic. China, because all this stuff needed to be made there, masks and ventilators, etc. Vietnam, because the factories that closed in China then went to Vietnam, and Cambodia, because, again, things in China were closed and went to Vietnam, and Laos. Venezuela, too, but I don't know how that happened. But really, who would think that a place of 1 billion people where all of a sudden you would see, okay, we're not growing. We are, like America's not growing in its economy, the largest economy in the world, but China is during this pandemic. So President Trump was a president who challenged Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping being the now 3-term prime minister of China. Prime minister is really a nice way of saying it. He's kind of a dictator. He's a dictator. Okay, he's a dictator. He's wielded so much power, it's out of control. Nicknamed the Prince, by the way. So these tariffs on Chinese imports that President Trump laid down, 3% to 19%, 8 to 21%, these are big, but it wasn't that China suffered. It wasn't the countries that suffered, but the companies who import these goods suffer. And now the companies need to spend more money for the products. So if you imported Chinese steel, well, you had to spend more money on importing Chinese steel because maybe you still couldn't afford American steel. The objective was to have things, quote unquote, made in America, but you couldn't. Economically, the world doesn't look like that right now. Globalization, 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 globalization. I'm going to stop this video right here when we talk in terms of the tariffs and whatnot. But when we look at Xi Jinping and how he rose to power in China, you're going to see what he's doing to China and the world and taking an iron grip on the Chinese people. And then we're also going to take a look at Chinese technology and surveillance that shows just how much of a grip the Chinese party, the People's Republic, the party itself has on China. So you'll then see how China really monitors the world. Enjoyed it. Have a great time. Be good.